He embraced Owain, and I heard the two men laugh. Owain was a tall man, but Arthur could look him in the eye, though he was nowhere near as heavily built as Owain. Owain was all muscle and bulk, while Arthur was a lean and wiry man. Owain thumped Arthur's back, and Arthur returned the affectionate gesture before the two men walked, their arms about each other's shoulders, to where Ralla was holding Mordred. Arthur fell to his knees before his king, and, with a surprising delicacy for a man in stiff, heavy armour, lifted a gloved hand to take the hem of the baby's robe. He pushed his helmet's hinged cheek-pieces aside, then kissed the robe. Mordred responded by screaming and struggling. Arthur stood and held his arms towards Morgan. She was older than her brother, who was still only 25 or 26 years old, but when he offered to embrace her, she began to cry behind her gold mask that clashed lightly against Arthur's helmet as they clasped each other. He held her tight and patted her back. "Dear Morgan," I heard him say. "Dear, sweet Morgan." I had never realized how lonely Morgan was until I saw her weep in her brother's arms. He pulled gently away from her grip, then used both his gloved hands to lift the silver-grey helmet from his head. "I have a gift for you," he told Morgan. "At least, I think I do. Unless Higwith's stolen it. Where are you, Higwith?" The servant Higwith ran forward and was given the white-plumed helmet in exchange for a necklace of bear's teeth that was set in gold sockets on a gold chain that Arthur hung around his sister's neck. "Something beautiful for my lovely sister," he said. And then he insisted on knowing who Ralla was, and when he heard about her baby's death, his face showed such pain and sympathy that Ralla began to weep, and Arthur impulsively hugged her and almost crushed the baby king against his scale-armoured chest. Then Gwilithin was introduced, and Gwilithin told Arthur how I had killed a Silurian to protect Mordred, and so Arthur swung round to thank me. And for the first time, I looked full into his face. It was a face of kindness. That was my first impression. No, that is what Igraine wants me to write. In truth, my first impression was of sweat, lots of sweat, come from wearing metal armour on a summer's day. But after the sweat, I noticed how kind he looked. You trusted Arthur on sight. That was why women always liked Arthur, not because he was good-looking, for he was not overly handsome, but because he looked at you with genuine interest and an obvious benevolence. He had a strong, bony face that was full of enthusiasm, and a full head of dark brown hair that, when I first saw him, was sweat-plastered tight to his skull, thanks to his helmet's leather liner. His eyes were brown. He had a long nose and a heavy, clean-shaven jaw, but his most noticeable feature was his mouth. It was unnaturally large and had a full set of teeth. He was proud of his teeth and cleaned them every day with salt when he could find it, and with plain water when he could not. It was a big face and a strong one, yet what impressed me most about him was that look of kindness and the impish humour in his eyes. There was an air of enjoyment about Arthur. Something in his face radiated a happiness that embraced you in its aura. I noticed then, and ever after, how men and women became more cheerful when Arthur was in their company. Everyone became more optimistic. There was more laughter, and when he departed, a dullness would ensue. Yet Arthur was no great wit, nor a storyteller. He was simply Arthur, a good man of infectious confidence, impatient will, and iron-hard resolve. You did not notice that hardness at first, and even Arthur himself pretended it was not there. Yet it was. A slew of battlefield graves bear witness to it. "Gwilithin tells me you're a Saxon," he teased me. "Lord," was all I could say as I dropped to my knees. He stooped and lifted me by the shoulders. His touch was firm. "I'm no king, Derval," he said. "You don't kneel to me. But I should kneel to you for risking your life to save our king." He smiled. "For that, I thank you." He had a knack of making you feel that no one else in the world mattered to him as much as you did, and I was already lost in worship of him. "How old are you?" he asked me. 15, I think. "But big enough for 20 years. He smiled. "Who taught you to fight?" "Howl," I said. "Merlin Stewart." "Ah, the best teacher. He taught me too. And how is good Howl?" The question was asked eagerly, but I had neither the words nor courage to answer. "Dead," Morgan answered for me. "Slain by Gunlius." She spat through the mouth-slit of her mask towards the captured king, who was being held a few paces away. "Howl dead?" Arthur asked the question of me, his eyes on mine, and I nodded and blinked back tears, and Arthur instantly hugged me. "You are a good man, Derval," he said, "and I owe you a reward for saving our king's life. What do you want?" "To be a warrior, Lord," I said. He smiled and stepped away from me. "You're a lucky man, Derval, because you are what you want to be. Lord Owain?" He turned to the burly, tattooed champion. "Can you use this good Saxon warrior?" "I can use him," Owain agreed readily enough. "Then he's your man," Arthur said. And he must have sensed my disappointment, for he turned back and rested a hand on my shoulder. "For the moment, Derval," he said softly, "I employ horsemen, not spearmen. Let Owain be your lord, for there's no one better to teach you the soldier's trade." He gripped my shoulder with his gloved hand, then turned and waved the 2 guards away from Gunlius's side. A crowd had gathered close to the captured king, who stood beneath the victor's banners. Arthur's horsemen, helmed with iron, armoured in iron-clad leather and cloaked in linen or wool, mingled with Owain's spearmen, and the Tor's fugitives about the grassy space, where Arthur now faced Gunlius. Gunlius straightened his back. He had no weapons, but he would not let go of his pride, nor did he flinch as Arthur approached. Arthur walked in silence until he stood 2 paces from the captured king. The crowd held its breath. Gunlius was shadowed by Arthur's standard that showed a black bear on a white field. The bear was flying between Mordred's recaptured dragon banner and Owain's boar standard, while at Gunlius's feet was his own fallen fox banner that had been spat on, pissed on, and trampled by the victors. Gunlius stared as Arthur drew Excalibur from its scabbard. The blade had a bluish tinge to its steel that was polished as brightly as Arthur's scale coat, helmet, or shield. We waited for the fatal stroke. But instead, Arthur dropped to one knee and held Excalibur's hilt to Gunlius. "Lord King," he said humbly, and the crowd, who had been anticipating Gunlius's death, gasped. Gunlius hesitated for a heartbeat, then reached out to touch the sword's pommel. He said nothing. Perhaps he was too astonished to speak. Arthur stood and sheathed the sword. "I took an oath to protect my king," he said, "not to kill kings. What happens to you, Gunlius ap Mylere, is not mine to decide. But you will be held captive till the decision is made." "Who makes that decision?" Gunlius demanded. Arthur hesitated, plainly unsure of the answer. Many of our warriors were shouting for Gunlius's death. Morgan was urging her brother to avenge Norwenna, while Nimue was shrieking for the captive king to be given to her revenge. But Arthur shook his head. Much later he explained to me that Gunlius was a cousin of Gorfithid, king of Powys, and that made Gunlius's death a matter of state, not revenge. I wanted to make peace, and peace rarely comes out of revenge, he admitted to me. But I probably should have killed him. Not that it would have made much difference. Now, though, facing Gunlius in the slanting sun outside Caer-Cadern, he merely said that Gunlius's fate was in the hands of Dumnonia's council. "And what of Ladwys?" Gunlius asked, gesturing towards the tall, pale-faced woman who stood close behind him with a look of terror on her face. "I ask that she be allowed to stay with me," he added. "The whore is mine," Owain said harshly. Ladwys shook her head and moved closer to Gunlius. "She's my wife," Gunlius protested to Arthur, thereby confirming the old rumour that he had indeed married his low-born lover, which also meant that he had married Norwenna falsely, though that sin, considering what else he did to her, was small indeed. "Wife or whatever," Owain insisted. "She is mine." He saw Arthur's hesitation. "Until the council decides otherwise," he added, in a deliberate echo of Arthur's invocation of that higher authority. Arthur seemed troubled by Owain's claim, but his position in Dumnonia was still uncertain, for though he had been named as Mordred's protector and one of the kingdom's warlords, that only gave him an authority equal to Owain's. All of us had noted how, in the wake of the Silurian rout, Arthur had taken charge, but Owain, by demanding Ladwys as his slave, was reminding Arthur that he held equal power. The moment was awkward, until Arthur sacrificed Ladwys to Dumnonian unity. "Owain has decided the matter," he said to Gunlius, then turned away so he would not have to witness the effect of his words on the lovers. Ladwys screamed her protest, then went silent as one of Owain's men dragged her away. Tanabers laughed at Ladwys's distress. He was a druid, so no harm would be done to him. He was no prisoner, but free to go, though he would have to leave the field without food, blessing, or company. Yet, emboldened by the day's events, I could not let him go without speaking, and so I followed him across the pasture that was littered with the Silurian dead. "Tanabers!" I called after him. The druid turned and watched me draw my sword. "Careful, boy," he said, and made a sign of warning with his moon-tipped staff. I should have felt fear, but a new warrior spirit filled me as I stepped close to him and placed the sword in the tangled white hairs of his beard. His head jerked back at the touch of the steel, rattling the yellow bones tied to his hair. His old face was lined, brown and blotchy, his eyes red and his nose twisted. "I ought to kill you," I said. He laughed. "And the curse of Britain will follow you. Your soul will never reach the other world. You will have torments unknown and unnumbered, and I will be their author." He spat towards me, then tried to push the sword blade out of his beard, but I tightened my grip on the hilt, and he suddenly looked alarmed as he realized my strength. A few curious onlookers had followed me, and some tried to warn me of the dreadful fate that would torment me if I killed a druid. But I had no intention of killing the old man. I just wanted to frighten him. 10 or more years ago," I said, "you came to Madoc's holding." Madoc was the man who had enslaved my mother, and whose homestead the young Gunlius had raided. Tanabers nodded as he remembered the raid. "So we did. So we did. A good day. We took much gold," he said, "and many slaves." "And you made a death pit," I said. "So?" He shrugged, then leered at me. "The gods must be thanked for good fortune.